The harsh, majestic wilderness of Montana grips travelers with its unforgiving cold. In the dead of winter, when the sprawling landscapes are buried in snow and blizzards rage, survival is dictated by instinct, resilience, and unwavering will. One fateful night, in the heart of a raging snowstorm, something truly remarkable occurred. A man named Hank Thompson and his daughter, Lily, a few miles from the safety of their cabin, suddenly realized they weren't alone. From the shadowy pine thicket emerged a tiny silhouette, a newborn Palace's cat Kitten, shivering and barely making a sound. As it took a few unsteady steps in the deep snow, it was clear this wild creature was seeking refuge. Could the father and daughter help it before the fierce storm doomed them all? This incredible story would change their lives, revealing themes of survival, trust, and an extraordinary journey into the very heart of life. Before we dive in, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to click the notification bell so you don't miss our latest amazing tales. The January wind howled ominously through the tops of the Montana pines. The wilderness stretched as far as the eye could see, and swirling snow reduced visibility to near zero. Hank Thompson, 53 years old, pulled his wool hat down over his ears. He adjusted the scarf his wife, Carol, had lovingly knitted years ago, ensuring no cold air could reach his face. Experience told him that winter in the northern Rockies showed no mercy. Beside him walked his 12-year-old daughter, Lily, in a bright blue snowsuit. Her voice was almost swallowed by the howling wind. But Hank encouraged her, assuring her they only had about a half-mile to the summit, where the view was breathtaking. "I promise, Lily," he said, checking his compass. Ever since Carol's passing 3 years prior, Lily eagerly anticipated each hike. These outings had become a special ritual for her and her father, allowing them to remember her mother and to feel connected to the nature that had been so important to Carol. Despite the weather forecast promising clear skies, Hank knew how treacherous mountain weather could be. A calm day could turn into a blizzard in an instant. And so it happened. Barely an hour into their hike, a snowstorm suddenly descended upon them. Their friendly outing transformed into a formidable challenge. Hank noticed Lily's cheeks were flushed with cold and suggested, "Should we turn back? Maybe we should go home and try again another time." Lily agreed sadly, though she felt disappointed. They turned around, retracing their own footsteps, which were already being partially covered by the snow. About 20 minutes into their return, Hank noticed something peculiar: tiny cat paw prints crisscrossing the snow, without visible claw marks. These weren't dog prints. Lily pointed to a sparse cluster of snow-covered fir trees, and they approached to see what was moving there. Before them was a reddish-gray creature, struggling to navigate the snowdrifts and barely lifting its head. "It's a Palace's cat," Hank whispered, trying not to scare the little thing. "Is something wrong with it?" Lily asked quietly, a worried empathy in her voice. Hank shook his head, though he wasn't entirely sure. The kitten looked like it had been separated from its mother by the storm, and it was clearly desperately fighting for survival. Before their astonished eyes, the furry creature let out a plaintive meow, its thin sound piercing the icy air. But the most incredible thing happened next. The Palace's cat headed straight toward them. It swayed, barely moving its paws, and sinking into the snow. Protruding ribs spoke of terrible exhaustion, and its eyes were dull with fatigue. It looked no more than 4 or 5 months old. There was no way it could survive alone in these conditions. "Dad, it needs help," Lily said, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's just doomed to die in the storm," Hank quietly confirmed. He had always taught Lily to treat wild animals with respect and caution, but now the Palace's cat Kitten was looking at them pleadingly. Leaving a living creature to certain death seemed unacceptable to him. "Okay," he finally said. "But we have to be very careful." Removing his warm wool scarf, Hank slowly approached the Palace's cat, speaking gently and calmly, even though he knew the animal wouldn't understand his words. "I want to help you," he said softly. The little one didn't even try to run, it simply didn't have the strength to be afraid. When Hank carefully picked it up, he could feel its heart racing. He then carefully tucked the kitten under his jacket to keep it warm and turned to his daughter. "Let's get back to the cabin as quickly as possible. Let's try to do everything we can." Lily hurried ahead to open the door and light the wood-burning stove, which they usually kept going before they left. Hank, cradling the frozen and exhausted Palace's cat, hurried behind her. Reaching the warm cabin, he carefully laid the tiny creature, wrapped in the scarf, on the table. Lily had already brought a heating pad, and together they prepared a simple meal: water, some jerky, and a thin nutritious mixture, everything that could give the exhausted creature strength. "We need to be prepared for the worst," Hank said with a sad sigh. "But let's hope for a miracle." Lily nodded, her eyes stubbornly shining with hope. "I know it'll be okay. We have to try." They took turns giving the rehydration fluid through a dropper, trying to bring the Palace's cat Kitten back to life, drop by drop. Outside, the blizzard raged, the roads were blocked, and reaching the nearest wildlife rehabilitation center was impossible. Hank could only contact them by satellite phone. The response from the staff was clear: the storm had cut off all routes, and help might not come for a while, meaning the family would have to become rescuers for a few days. "Dad, do you think we can give it a name?" Lily asked later that night, sitting on the floor next to the basket where the furry lodger was curled up. Actually, we shouldn't tame it. It's a wild animal," Hank reminded her. "If it gets better, it has to go back into the wild." "I know, but while it's here, it needs a name," Lily insisted. "Maybe Asher. His fur is a little smoky, and we found him when he was nearly gone, almost turned to ash." Hearing this, Hank smiled. Although he had his doubts, he didn't object. The main thing was to keep the kitten warm and give it some hope. To their relief, the kitten was still breathing in the morning, and by midday, it even started to lift its head and weakly try to lick its fur, a sure sign that life was still in it. The storm raged for 3 days, turning the cabin into their only fortress. During this time, Lily and Hank managed to make a makeshift bottle for Asher with milk and egg mixture, as well as small pieces of jerky. On the 4th day, the snowstorm subsided, and there was a lull. The Palace's cat Kitten became noticeably more active and even tried to stand on its paws, exploring the room with strange curiosity. When the roads were finally cleared, the rehabilitation center staff offered for Hank to bring the little creature to them. Their specialists could continue the treatment there. But, to the surprise of the father and daughter, it turned out that the winter season and previous rescue operations had fully loaded the center. There was no capacity to accept a new pet yet. Learning about Hank and Lily's efforts, a staff member suggested they keep the Palace's cat under temporary supervision and consult with veterinarians periodically. "They want us to keep him until there's space or he's strong enough to return to the wild," Hank said, his voice reflecting inner excitement. Lily's eyes lit up with joy. "Really? So we can take care of him for a while? Just don't forget, this decision is temporary," her father insisted. "We need to minimize contact so Asher doesn't get too used to people. After all, the goal is to release him into the wild." Lily tried very hard to follow these rules, but it wasn't easy. On the advice of specialists, Hank built a spacious enclosure on the glassed-in porch, where the Palace's cat could have fresh air, protection from the elements, and the opportunity to enjoy the smells of the forest. Every day, Lily would sit beside it for hours, reading books aloud, trying not to cross the invisible boundary separating the wild creature from humans. Surprisingly, Asher showed no fear, perhaps he felt he had been given a second chance here. With the arrival of spring, the kitten's behavior began to change. He became increasingly restless in his enclosure, often gazing at the forest beyond the glass. One evening in early March, Hank said, "It's time to get him used to the natural environment. Let him feel freedom again." The Wildlife Center staff recommended taking Asher into the forest on a long leash. This would allow him to restore his hunting instincts while remaining relatively safe. At first, the palace's cat was nervous. Unfamiliar sounds, spaces, and smells confused him, and he clung to Lily's legs. But each new walk gave him confidence, and soon the wild nature of the palace's cat became increasingly apparent. He began to stalk small animals and practice his hunting skills. In April, the leash was removed. Asher was quite comfortable among the trees, and although Lily and Hank stayed at a distance, the kitten could move freely through the forest. Sometimes they called him, and he would come back, almost like a domestic cat, which made Hank feel mixed emotions. He understood that a real palace's cat shouldn't respond to a human's call. The attachment had become too strong. Then, the specialists gave the next advice: stop calling him, leave Asher in the forest longer and longer, giving him the opportunity to make his own choice. This became a real challenge for Lily. "Dad, he doesn't want to stay out there," she once said with despair, sitting on the porch and listening to the plaintive sound that echoed across the clearing as Asher appeared at the cabin again. Hank, putting his arm around her shoulders, explained, "Someday, he'll feel the call of his wild nature and want to stay in the forest. That's better for his future. If we keep him here only for our own desires, we'll be betraying the very purpose of the palace's cat." Soon, the palace's cat stopped coming back every evening. The day came when he didn't show up the next morning, or the second night, or the third. Lily cried quietly, asking her father if Asher was okay. But Hank assured her that their furry ward had grown strong enough and would certainly find his way in the vast expanses of mountainous Montana. Days passed, and when Lily had already begun to accept the idea that the palace's cat had completely gone into the wild, something special happened. One morning, as Hank was chopping wood near the house, he noticed a familiar silhouette among the pines. It was Asher. He looked stronger and bigger, and his posture conveyed proud confidence. Hank quietly called his daughter, and she went out onto the porch with incredible excitement, slightly holding her breath. Asher stood in the clearing and looked intently at them. Lily slowly knelt down, extending her hand forward. For a moment, the palace's cat froze, then gently nudged his head into her hand, as if saying, "Thank you," then briefly touched Hank and purred softly. Then he turned abruptly and sped back into the thicket, turning back at the last boundary only once, as if saying a final goodbye. "He hasn't forgotten us," Lily said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "And he never will," Hank replied warmly. "But now he belongs to this land, which is calling him to true freedom." Years later, when it was her 16th birthday, Hank gave Lily a small carved figurine of a palace's cat. He himself decorated it with delicate details, as if conveying the animal's living character. "It should remind you that the truest love sometimes requires letting go of those we cherish," he explained and, smiling, added that Carol would surely be proud of them both. And in the stillness of the approaching twilight, high in the sky, the echo of a wild palace's cat cry carried, resonant and free, as if confirming that life continues where it should, in the untamed element of Montana, where harsh nature gives tests and at the same time wonderful gifts to everyone who dares to love and understand it. May this story remind us of the importance of valuing, respecting, and protecting wildlife, and most importantly, knowing when to give it freedom. If you enjoyed this inspiring story about the palace's cat and survival in mountainous Montana, give it a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss other exciting stories about wildlife.